The man had been watching us for hours before he fired the shot. I didn't hear the bullet coming. I just felt the sickening thud of my dad's body hitting the forest floor. It was late October, the kind of day where the sun barely peeked over the mountain ridges, casting long shadows over the dense forest. My dad and I had been planning this trip to the Smokies for weeks, and we finally had a clear Saturday. The air was crisp, the leaves had turned vibrant shades of red and orange, and the forest floor was blanketed with a thick layer of fallen leaves that crunched underfoot. Dad had always been the outdoorsy type, teaching me how to track deer, set up camp, and most importantly, how to stay quiet, so quiet that the forest would accept you as part of its stillness. That morning, we set off with our rifles slung over our shoulders, the weight of the gear familiar and reassuring. I loved these moments with him. The vast, isolated stretches of wilderness, the kind of quiet you only find in places like this, broken only by the occasional bird call or rustling of leaves in the wind. We had been walking for hours, deep into the heart of the Smokies, further than I had ever been. The forest felt endless, towering trees surrounding us in every direction. It was around noon when I first noticed something was off. The forest, once alive with sounds, had gone unnervingly silent. At first, I couldn't pinpoint why it felt wrong, but it was as though the trees themselves had stopped whispering, the wind no longer moving through the leaves. I was about to mention it to Dad when I heard it, a faint sound just behind us. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps, crushing the leaves. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. They stopped the moment we did. "Dad!" I whispered, my voice tight with fear. He held up his hand, signaling me to stay still. I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes narrowed as he scanned the dense woods, his calm demeanor slowly cracking. We started walking again, this time a little faster. The footsteps resumed, keeping pace with us. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We weren't alone. Someone was following us. Dad shot me a glance, his face pale. "Stay close," he murmured, gripping his rifle tighter. We quickened our pace, our steps no longer quiet. I could feel the tension coiling in my chest, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The footsteps continued, closer now, faster. We broke into a run, dodging between trees, our boots slipping on the damp leaves. I could hear him behind us, crashing through the undergrowth, closing the distance. Whoever it was, they weren't just following us, they were hunting us. We stumbled into a small clearing, the sudden openness making me feel exposed, vulnerable. Dad grabbed my arm and pulled me down behind a large rock. "Stay low, stay quiet," he hissed, his voice barely a whisper. The fear in his eyes was something I'd never seen before, and it terrified me more than anything. We crouched there, hidden in the shadows, barely breathing. Through the dense branches, I saw him, a man, tall and broad, moving through the trees with a rifle slung over his shoulder. His face was partially obscured by the hood of his jacket, but I could feel his eyes sweeping the area, searching for us. My entire body went rigid, every muscle screaming to stay still, to not make a sound. The man stopped just a few feet from our hiding spot, his breath visible in the cool mountain air. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. If he moved even a little closer, he would find us. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying he would move on. For what felt like an eternity, he stood there, his head slowly turning as he scanned the area. Then, without warning, he walked on, his footsteps growing fainter as he disappeared deeper into the forest. We stayed hidden long after he was gone, too scared to move, the weight of the danger pressing down on us like a suffocating blanket. When we finally crawled out from behind the rock, the forest felt different, darker, more menacing. The peaceful isolation of the Smokies, which I had always loved, now felt like a trap. Every rustle, every shadow seemed to hide unseen eyes, watching us. We didn't speak as we made our way back to the trailhead, both of us constantly glancing over our shoulders. The weight of what had just happened hung between us, unspoken but heavy. But then the shot rang out. My dad hit the ground before I realized what had happened. Blood pooled beneath him, seeping into the fallen leaves. I screamed, but no one heard. The man stepped out from behind the trees, his rifle still smoking, his face hidden beneath that hood. He was still out there, and now he was coming for me. It had been an uneventful night at the morgue, just another shift that started with the same sterile, cold routine. My job didn't bother me anymore. The dead didn't scare me. It was the living that occasionally sent a chill down my spine. I was used to the quiet. The morgue, with its fluorescent lighting and cold, linoleum floors, was always the same, a place of stillness. I preferred it that way, but that night was different. The trouble started when I noticed a man lingering in the hallway just outside the morgue door. He was tall, his clothes hanging loose on his thin frame. His eyes were fixed on the door with an unnerving intensity, like he was waiting for something. The air felt heavy as soon as I saw him, and for reasons I couldn't quite place, my stomach tightened. I watched him for a moment, hoping he'd just wander off like most people did when they realized they were in the wrong place. But he didn't. He just stood there, his posture stiff, his head tilted slightly, as though he could see through the door. Something about the way he stared felt invasive, like he wasn't just looking at the door, but threw it at the dead inside. I walked over, trying to appear casual, though the growing unease gnawed at me. I asked if he needed help, but he didn't answer right away. He just turned his head slowly toward me, his eyes wide and unblinking, as if I had interrupted something important. The way he looked at me made my skin crawl. There was something off, something wrong, but I couldn't figure out what. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and flat, asking about access to the basement. His words came out slow, deliberate, like he had practiced them beforehand. "Is the basement open tonight?" he asked, his tone unsettling, almost as though the question was meant to carry more weight than it did. I told him the basement was restricted, only accessible to authorized personnel, but he didn't seem to care about my answer. He shifted slightly, his eyes drifting back to the morgue door, lingering there again. It was like he didn't hear me at all. My pulse quickened. Something wasn't right. I asked if he was lost, but he didn't answer. Instead, he mumbled something about wanting to see where they keep the bodies. The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Who asked something like that? His tone was flat, too calm, too detached. He was asking about dead bodies as if he were inquiring about the weather. I watched him closely, my instincts screaming at me to stay on guard. He wasn't just curious. He was fixated. The way his eyes darted from the morgue door back to me. It was clear he had been here before. I could feel it in the way he lingered, in the way he knew exactly where to stand. This wasn't the first time he had loitered around this part of the building. I told him he needed to leave, and for a moment, he just stood there, staring at me with that same hollow expression. Then, slowly, he turned and walked away, but not far, just far enough to be out of sight. I stayed still for a moment, trying to shake the feeling that he wasn't really gone. The rest of my shift, I couldn't focus. I felt his presence like a shadow, always hovering, always just out of view. I kept glancing toward the hallway, expecting to see him standing there again, his eyes glued to the door. The silence in the morgue, once comforting, now felt oppressive, like the walls themselves were closing in. It wasn't until later, when I was talking to one of the night security guards, that I learned the truth. The man had been caught before. He had been trying to enter restricted areas late at night, asking strange questions about the morgue, about the bodies, about where they were stored. His curiosity wasn't innocent. It was obsessive. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as the guard explained that the man had been escorted out several times in the past few weeks. They hadn't thought much of it before, just another disturbed individual wandering around. But now, with the way he had lingered, the way he had spoken to me, I couldn't shake the feeling that his interest was something darker. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old building made me think of him, standing just outside my door waiting. I kept imagining his eyes, cold and empty, staring at the morgue door, as though he was waiting for a moment to slip inside. Even now, days later, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, somewhere, watching, waiting for another chance to get inside. And I can't help but wonder what he plans to do once he does. When I first moved into the house, it seemed like the perfect neighborhood. Quiet, well-kept lawns, the occasional passerby walking their dog, and a peaceful sense of suburbia that felt like a welcome escape from the chaotic city. Everything seemed in place, neat and predictable. But that was before I noticed the neighbors across the street. Their house was immaculate. Too immaculate, maybe. The lawn was perfectly trimmed, the hedges neatly pruned, and the windows always seemed to sparkle as if they were cleaned every day. But what struck me as odd was that I never saw anyone actually take care of the house. I never saw the owners outside. In fact, I never saw them at all. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe they were private people, or just didn't like socializing. But weeks turned into months, and the eeriness of it all began to sink in. Not once did I see them step outside. No one ever waved to me from their driveway. No children played in the yard. No conversations echoed through the air. It was as if the house itself was just an empty shell with no life inside. What made it worse was that I'd catch glimpses of them, sometimes through the windows. Just shadows, really flickers of movement behind the curtains, as if they were always watching but never coming out. The house was always quiet, always dark at night. I began to wonder about them more and more. Why didn't they ever leave? Why didn't they ever speak? I tried to shake off the creeping discomfort, but it was hard to ignore. There was something deeply unsettling about living next to a house that felt more like a tomb than a home. One evening, I was sitting on my front porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the sky turning shades of pink and orange. The other neighbors were going about their usual routines. Someone mowing their lawn, kids playing in the street. But the house across the street remained still, as always. I remember the moment so clearly when my gaze drifted back to the house. There they were, standing at the window. Two figures, barely visible in the dim light, just standing there, looking out toward me. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the fact that they were watching. It was the way they stood so unnaturally still, their faces obscured by the shadows inside. It was as though they knew I was watching them, and yet they didn't move. For a moment, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The air felt heavier, like the evening had shifted somehow, becoming darker even before the sun fully set. I tried to look away, to focus on something else, but my eyes kept drifting back. I waited for them to move, to do something, anything, but they didn't. They just stood there statuesque, locked in their vigil by the window. It wasn't until the last sliver of sunlight vanished that the figures finally stepped back, disappearing into the depths of the house. I couldn't see them anymore, but the feeling of being watched lingered long after. I felt trapped by their silence, by their absence of life. Over the next few days, things got worse. I began waking up in the middle of the night, certain that I had heard something, footsteps maybe. I'd lie in bed, my ears straining for any sound, but the house remained still. When I finally gathered the courage to peek through my blinds, I could see the house across the street, dark and looming, the windows blank and expressionless. But I could feel them watching. The final straw came one rainy afternoon. I had taken a day off from work, feeling too drained and uneasy to deal with the world. I was in my living room, trying to distract myself with TV when I heard it, the sound of my front door handle jiggling. I froze, my blood running cold. I hadn't heard anyone approach. Slowly, cautiously, I moved toward the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I peeked through the peephole, expecting to see a delivery driver or maybe a neighbor. But there was no one there, just the empty street and the rain pouring down, slicking the pavement. I stood there, staring at the empty space where someone should have been, trying to shake off the creeping dread that clawed at the back of my mind. But as I turned away, something caught my eye. A flicker of movement in the corner of the window across the street. I looked over, and for the briefest moment, I saw them again, the neighbors standing in their window watching. But this time I was sure of it. They had been outside my house. They had tried my door. And now they were back in their darkened home, hidden away, waiting. I don't go out much anymore. Not since that day. I keep my blinds drawn, my doors locked. I've thought about moving, but somehow the thought of leaving feels wrong, like they wouldn't let me go. They're still there, in that perfect, silent house across the street. Watching, always watching. It was a slow night, the kind where the hours seemed to stretch into eternity. The kind of night every delivery driver dreads. I'd been out since the early evening, and by the time the last order came through, it was already close to midnight. My boss texted me the address. One of those forgotten neighborhoods at the edge of town where the streetlights flicker or don't work at all. It was a rundown area full of old houses and boarded-up windows, the kind of place that made you double-check your locks when you drove through. The order was for a single pizza. Nothing unusual, but the location made me uneasy. The roads were dark, lined with houses that seemed to be sinking into themselves, their facades weathered and abandoned. The further I drove, the more the neighborhood faded into silence, like the life had been drained from it. No cars, no people, just empty streets. My headlights barely pierced the gloom as I turned down the last street. The house I was delivering to stood at the very end, a lone figure in a row of dilapidated homes, barely illuminated by the single flickering streetlight out front. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, staring at the house. Something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong in the world of the living. The paint was peeling, the windows dark and smudged, the yard overgrown with weeds. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just another weird stop, like so many I'd done before. The air outside was cold, biting through my thin jacket as I grabbed the pizza and headed toward the front door. The gravel crunched under my shoes, unnaturally loud in the stillness. Everything felt too quiet, as if the world had stopped and I hadn't noticed. No sound of wind, no distant hum of traffic, just silence. I knocked on the door, my knuckles echoing hollow against the wood. No answer. I knocked again, glancing around, half expecting someone to step out of the shadows. But nothing. The porch light flickered weakly above me, casting long, jagged shadows across the yard. I was about to leave when I heard it, a faint sound, barely audible over the pounding in my chest. A rustling from the side of the house. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, straining to hear. It sounded like someone or something moving just out of sight. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I turned slowly toward the source of the noise, my breath caught in my throat. There, in the bushes near the side of the house, I saw movement. At first, it was just a slight shifting of leaves, almost like the wind had picked up, but there was no wind. I felt the cold grip of fear tightening in my chest. I squinted, trying to make out what was there, and that's when I saw him, a figure crouched low, half hidden in the shadows. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized he wasn't moving toward the house. He was watching me. A wave of panic surged through me. I wasn't alone. I wanted to back away, but my feet were rooted to the spot. My eyes locked on the figure, barely visible in the dim light. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched me with an intensity that sent a chill through my entire body. I couldn't stay there. I turned, walking quickly back toward my car, trying to act like I hadn't seen anything. But with every step, I felt his eyes on me, felt the weight of his presence. My hands were trembling as I fumbled for the car keys. The pizza slipped slightly under my arm, and for a brief, terrifying second, I thought about just dropping it and running. But I didn't. I forced myself to keep moving, my breath shallow and fast, my skin prickling with the feeling that I wasn't going to make it back to the car. That feeling of being watched, it was suffocating. As I reached for the car door, I heard another noise, a quick rustling, then a sharp snap like someone stepping on a branch. I froze, my hand inches from the door handle. The sound came from behind me, and I knew without turning around that he had moved closer. The realization hit me hard. He wasn't just watching anymore. I yanked the car door open, throwing myself inside, slamming it shut with shaking hands. My heart was pounding in my throat, every muscle screaming at me to get out of there. I started the engine, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. There he was, standing at the edge of the yard now, his form barely visible in the darkness. He was holding something, a bag, maybe. I couldn't tell. I threw the car into gear and sped off, the tires screeching as I peeled away from the house. My breath came in short gasps, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in the safety of the main streets, surrounded by people, by light. But the feeling never left me, the feeling that I had interrupted something. The next morning, I couldn't shake the image of the man standing there in the dark, watching me. When I checked the local news later that day, I saw a story. A woman had been found in that same neighborhood, just a few streets over. She had been fleeing from her ex, a dangerous man, the article said, known for stalking his victims. I didn't want to think about how close I had come to seeing more than I bargained for, or that maybe, just maybe, I had unknowingly interrupted what could have been her final moments. I've always liked staying late after school, when the building is quiet and most of the students have already left. There's something peaceful about the emptiness, the way the fluorescent lights buzz softly, the faint hum of the heating system in the background. It was my time to catch up on grading, plan lessons, and just enjoy the rare moment of stillness in a usually chaotic place. That afternoon wasn't any different at first. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the empty hallways, and I could hear the distant sound of a janitor's cart rattling a few corridors away. The classroom was quiet, the only noise the gentle rustling of papers as I shuffled through assignments. My classroom faced the back of the school, overlooking a small, neglected courtyard that no one really used. It was bordered by a chain-link fence, and beyond that, an old, overgrown patch of trees that stretched out into the distance. As I sat at my desk, my eyes occasionally drifted to the large windows at the back of the room. The light was fading, and the glass reflected the dimming sky, painting the room with a strange, orange glow. I wasn't thinking about much, just the usual end-of-day thoughts. What I'd cook for dinner, when I'd finally get to leave, that sort of thing. But then, something caught my eye. At first, I thought I was imagining it. A flicker of movement, just beyond the window, barely noticeable in the fading light. I stared at the glass for a few moments, waiting for it to happen again, but nothing moved. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the wind, maybe a branch swaying in the breeze. A few minutes later, though, it happened again. This time, it wasn't just a flicker, it was more distinct. A shape, dark and vague, moving in the shadows outside. My heart gave a little lurch, but I tried to stay calm. It was probably just one of the janitors, I told myself. Maybe someone was working late, cleaning up the courtyard. But as I sat there, staring out into the growing darkness, a strange feeling began to creep over me. The kind of feeling that tightens in your chest and makes you feel as though you're being watched. I couldn't shake it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder, as if expecting to see someone standing behind me. But the room was empty. Just me, alone in the dim light of the classroom. I turned my gaze back to the window, squinting against the reflection of the fluorescent lights. That's when I saw it. A face. It was faint at first, barely more than a shadow pressed against the glass. But as I leaned forward, trying to make out the features, my stomach tightened in fear. There was no mistaking it. A face was peering in through the window, watching me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was motionless, its features obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me. Staring. I couldn't move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no way someone could be standing outside the window. It didn't make sense. The classroom was on the second floor, far above the courtyard. There were no balconies, no ledges. Whoever, or whatever, should not have been able to reach that window. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Fear rooted me to the spot. The face remained pressed against the glass, unmoving, unblinking. The shadows from the trees outside twisted around it, making it hard to see clearly, but I could feel its gaze locked on me. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating, as though the walls were closing in. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a trick of the light or a reflection from something outside. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The face was real, and it was watching me. My pulse raced as I finally tore my eyes away, forcing myself to stand up. I needed to leave to get out of that room. I grabbed my bag, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the zipper. The room felt colder now, as if the temperature had dropped suddenly. My eyes kept flicking back to the window, expecting the face to disappear, or move, or do something. But it stayed there, still and silent, waiting. As I rushed toward the door, I dared one last glance back. The face was gone. The window was empty, reflecting only the darkening sky and the faint glow of the streetlights beyond. The fear lingered, though, curling around my insides like a cold, relentless hand. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty glass, trying to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. But I hadn't. I knew what I had seen. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the face at the window, staring in at me from the darkness. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that it was just a trick of the mind, a shadow playing tricks. But the next day, as I walked back into my classroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, something that wasn't supposed to be. And the worst part, I never saw it leave. It was nearly 1 a.m. when I pulled into the parking lot of the 24/7 convenience store. The rain had started earlier that night, a steady downpour that now blanketed everything in a cold, wet sheen. I hadn't meant to be out this late, but I had run out of basic groceries, and with nothing better to do on a sleepless night, I figured I'd make the quick trip. The store was a familiar one, just a few miles from my place, where the lights always seemed too bright against the darkness of the empty streets. The parking lot was almost deserted. The rain tapped relentlessly against the windshield, the rhythmic sound almost hypnotic. Only one other car was parked on the far side, its windows fogged up, but no sign of anyone inside. I hesitated for a moment, staring out into the dark, empty lot. Something felt off, but I couldn't place it. Maybe it was just the hour. Things always seemed different this late at night. I grabbed my keys and stepped out, the cold rain instantly soaking through my jacket. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with the scent of wet concrete and distant streetlights buzzing faintly in the distance. I quickened my pace, not wanting to linger outside any longer than necessary. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss as I stepped into the fluorescent glare of the store. Inside, the store was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the coolers along the back wall. The silence was unsettling, especially under the harsh, artificial light. Rows of shelves stretched out before me, stocked with the same mundane items I'd seen countless times before: chips, sodas, canned goods. Everything in its place, everything normal, except for the feeling creeping up my spine. The emptiness felt unnatural. Normally, even late at night, there'd be a bored cashier at the counter, maybe a couple of stragglers wandering the aisles. But tonight, there was no one. The store felt deserted. I wandered past the aisles, grabbing what I needed: a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, some snacks. As I moved through the store, the fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch and shrink with every blink. My footsteps echoed softly against the tiled floor, the only sound breaking the stillness. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I reached for an item, I felt it, a presence just on the edge of my awareness. I glanced down each aisle as I passed, but they were all empty. No other customers, no employees, just me. A prickle of unease ran through me. I told myself it was nothing, that it was just a late hour messing with my head. But the feeling only grew stronger as I made my way to the back of the store to grab a bottle of water from the cooler. The lights flickered again, casting a brief, almost imperceptible darkness over the aisles. It only lasted a second, but in that second I could have sworn I saw something move. I turned sharply, my heart racing in my chest. But the aisle was empty, just rows of snacks and drinks, perfectly still under the flickering lights. My pulse quickened, the growing sense of dread pressing down on me. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling lingered, like a shadow that wouldn't go away. I hurried back to the front of the store, eager to check out and get back to the safety of my car. But when I reached the counter, the cashier wasn't there. The stool behind the counter sat empty, the register untouched. My stomach twisted. Where was everyone? I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The store was completely silent, the kind of silence that felt wrong. Too thick, too heavy. I glanced toward the doors, half expecting someone to walk in, to break the unsettling stillness. But no one came. I considered leaving the groceries behind, just walking out and pretending none of this had happened. But as I turned to head for the door, I heard it, a soft noise, barely audible over the hum of the coolers. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere deeper in the store. My heart skipped a beat. The sound was faint, like someone trying to move quietly, but not quite succeeding. I froze listening. The footsteps grew louder, moving closer, but I couldn't tell where they were coming from. The aisle stretched out in front of me like a maze, and the thought of someone, something, moving silently among them sent a wave of panic through me. I couldn't stand there any longer. I turned and rushed for the exit, my footsteps loud and clumsy on the tile. The automatic doors slid open with a hiss, and I burst into the rain, my chest tight with fear. I fumbled with my keys, glancing back at the store. Through the glass, I saw nothing but the empty aisles, the fluorescent lights flickering like they had before. I yanked the car door open and threw myself inside, locking the doors with shaking hands. The rain pounded against the roof, drowning out every other sound. My breath came in short, ragged bursts as I stared at the store, waiting for something or someone to appear. But no one did. I didn't wait any longer. I slammed the car into reverse and sped out of the parking lot, the tires skidding on the slick pavement. I didn't stop driving until I was back home, the empty streets of the city stretching out behind me. I still don't know what I heard that night, or who was there, but I haven't gone back to that store since. And every time I pass it, I feel that same cold dread creeping over me again, as if the store itself is watching, waiting for me to return. It was supposed to be a relaxing evening, the kind where the smell of grilled meat and the sound of quiet conversation fill the air. Our apartment complex had a small barbecue area tucked away behind the main building, hidden by a row of trees. It was quiet there, a little too secluded for some people's taste, but I liked it. I had planned to spend the evening grilling some burgers and enjoying the warm summer night by myself. The barbecue area had always been underused. Most people in the complex preferred to stay indoors, so it was rare to see anyone else out there. That's why I liked it. Just me, the grill, and the cool breeze cutting through the summer heat. It was peaceful. But that night, something felt different. I had just gotten the coals hot, the orange glow casting flickering shadows across the concrete patio. The sky was darkening, the last traces of sunlight disappearing behind the trees that surrounded the complex. The place was unusually silent, only the occasional chirp of crickets breaking the stillness. As I stood there, watching the flames lick the edges of the grill, I became acutely aware of how isolated I was. The trees around the area loomed like a dark wall, and the only light came from the dim porch lights far in the distance, their glow barely reaching the edges of the barbecue area. The shadows felt heavier tonight, longer, more pronounced, as though they were pressing in from all sides. I tried to ignore the creeping unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach. It was just a normal night, I told myself. I was alone, the same way I always was. No one ever came out here. But then I noticed movement, just at the edge of my vision. I turned sharply, squinting into the darkness beyond the small circle of light cast by the grill. At first, I saw nothing, just the dense trees and the faint outline of the path that led back to the apartment buildings. But then there was again a flicker of motion, like something or someone moving between the trees. I froze, my hand gripping the spatula tightly, my heart beginning to race. I strained my ears, listening for any sound, footsteps, rustling leaves, anything. But the night was eerily quiet. Too quiet. The air felt heavy, thick with tension. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the food, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe a squirrel or a stray cat had wandered too close. That had to be it. But as I stood there, flipping the burgers and pretending everything was fine, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. I could feel eyes on me, somewhere out in the darkness, watching my every move. I glanced over my shoulder again, this time more slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. And then there a figure just at the edge of the light. It was faint, barely visible in the shadows, but unmistakable. Someone was standing there, watching me. My heart lurched in my chest, my breath catching in my throat. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, a dark shape against the blackness of the trees. I turned back to the grill, my mind racing. I couldn't tell if they were getting closer or just standing still, but the fact that they hadn't moved at all was somehow worse. My hands trembled as I adjusted the heat on the grill, trying to keep my movements calm, deliberate. I didn't want to let them know that I had seen them. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. The sound of the sizzling meat was the only thing breaking the silence, and the smell of smoke filled the air, thick and suffocating. My pulse pounded in my ears, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something. I slowly turned around, scanning the area where I had seen the figure. But they were gone. The trees stood silent, the shadows still and unmoving. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Where had they gone? Had they left? Or were they still there, hiding just out of sight? I hastily packed up my things, the burgers forgotten, now charred on the grill. I needed to get out of there. The walk back to the apartment felt longer than usual, the path darker, every shadow a potential hiding place. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the figure again, to see them step out from the trees and follow me. But the path remained empty. Back inside my apartment, I locked the door behind me, my hands shaking as I slid the bolt into place. The feeling of being watched still hadn't left. Even as I stood in the safety of my brightly lit kitchen, I couldn't shake the image of the figure standing at the edge of the barbecue area, watching me from the shadows. I never went back there at night after that. It was supposed to be my quiet place, a spot where I could relax and unwind. But now it felt different. Something had changed that night, and I couldn't forget it. The barbecue area wasn't mine anymore. It was just another evening in the city, the kind of night where the streets were alive with the hum of traffic and the soft chatter of people spilling out of restaurants and bars. I had been walking home, minding my own business, keeping to the well-lit paths like I always did. The rain had started about an hour ago, light at first, but now was coming down hard. The cold drizzle soaked through my jacket, turning the pavement slick and shining under the streetlights. Everything seemed normal, just another typical night. I was only a few blocks away from my apartment when I decided to cut through an alley, a shortcut I had taken 100 times before. It was narrow and poorly lit, the kind of place you wouldn't want to linger in, but I never thought twice about it. Tonight, though, something felt different. As I stepped into the alley, a chill ran down my spine, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. The alley was quieter than usual, the sound of the city fading behind me as I ventured deeper. The only noise was the steady drip of rainwater from the gutters and the occasional splash as my shoes hit a puddle. I told myself it was just the weather making me uneasy, that the shadows looked longer because of the way the light hit the wet ground, but the further I walked, the more uneasy I became. I kept my head down, picking up my pace, eager to reach the end of the alley. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. They were soft at first, barely noticeable, but unmistakable. Someone else was in the alley. I glanced over my shoulder, and my heart sank. A figure just at the edge of the light, following me. I couldn't make out their face, but they were tall, their silhouette dark against the dim glow of the streetlights. A creeping sense of dread tightened in my chest. I sped up, hoping I was just being paranoid, that they'd turn off at the next street or disappear back into the city. But the footsteps quickened too, matching my pace, staying just far enough behind to keep me on edge. I kept walking, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, that maybe they were just taking the same shortcut. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I could feel their eyes on me, like a weight pressing down between my shoulder blades. Hey there, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Thank all of you